The searing pain in her shoulder felt like liquid fire spreading through her body, each heartbeat sending fresh waves of agony that made her vision blur and her breath come in ragged gasps. Abigail Kozlov pressed her back against the rough bark of a willow tree, her left hand clutching the leather tube that contained everything she had left of Nikolai, while her right hand pressed uselessly against the wound that continued to leak her life into the cold creek water. The voices of her attackers echoed from somewhere up the ridge, their laughter cruel and confident as they discussed whether to return and finish the job proper. She could hear Grinning Tom's distinctive drawl above the others joking about how the foreign widow had squealed when the bullet took her down, how she'd probably crawled off somewhere to die like a wounded animal. The casual cruelty in their voices made her stomach turn even as terror froze her blood. Her ankle throbbed where she twisted it in the fall, swollen and useless, making every attempt to move an exercise in pure agony. But she had to move, had to find somewhere to hide before they came back to make sure she was dead. Using her good arm, she began dragging herself deeper into the tangle of willow roots, the leather tube pressed against her chest like a shield against the world's cruelty. Nikolai's final gift to her. His life's work the only thing that could give meaning to his death and possibly secure her future if she lived long enough to use it. The creek water was shockingly cold against her fevered skin, and she could feel consciousness slipping away like sand through her fingers. But she held on, driven by a stubborn refusal to let Tom Briggs and his kind win, to let Nikolai's murder go unavenged. As darkness closed in around the edges of her vision, her last coherent thought was a prayer to whatever power might be listening that someone, anyone, would find her before the killers returned. The August sun blazed mercilessly over the pine-covered ridges above Copper Gulch, turning the Dakota Territory air thick as molasses and dry as bleached bone. Ohitika moved through the timber with the fluid silence of a born predator, each moccasin step placed with deliberate care on the needle-strewn earth. At 34, the Lakota Warrior carried himself with the easy confidence that came from years of reading the land's moods like sacred text. His shortened Springfield rifle cavalry markings, filed smooth but still faintly visible, rested comfortable in the crook of his arm. The weapon had found its way to him through trade 3 winters past, and though its walnut stock bore the honest scars of hard use, it remained as dependable as sunrise. His buckskin shirt, darkened with sweat and marked by careful repairs, stretched across shoulders that spoke of both honest labor and deadly combat. A single eagle feather hung braided into his black hair, marking him as a man who had earned respect through deeds rather than empty words. The elk trail he followed curved around a massive ponderosa, its bark scarred by antlers from countless seasons. But something made him pause at the bend, his dark eyes narrowing as they caught what others might have missed entirely. Blood drops on the forest floor, still crimson enough to be fresh, still warm enough to carry the metallic scent of fear and violence. This was no elk blood. Drag marks scored the earth where the crimson trail veered sharply toward Willow Creek, carved into the soil with the desperate irregularity of someone fighting against being pulled along against their will. Ohitika knelt, touching one of the drops with a calloused fingertip. The warmth confirmed what his instincts already knew: someone was badly hurt, and recently. He followed the blood trail through the underbrush with growing urgency, his rifle now held ready for whatever trouble awaited. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he approached the creek, and there, half submerged in the willow roots that gave the waterway its name, he found her. The woman lay motionless, except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest, her calico dress torn and mud-stained, one sleeve soaked dark with blood from a wound in her shoulder. Her left ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, swollen and discolored. Auburn hair, once pinned neat and proper, now spread loose around a face pale as winter moonlight. She appeared no more than 26, but the fine lines around her closed eyes suggested she had already made acquaintance with hardship. A spent. 44 to 40. cartridge gleamed in the mud beside her, its brass case catching dappled sunlight that filtered through the willows. The evidence painted a picture clear as mountain water. She had been shot and left to die like a wounded animal. Ohiteka was reaching for her wrist to check for pulse when rifle fire cracked from the ridge above. The woman's eyes snapped open, revealing irises the color of winter sky, wild with terror and pain. "Sweet Mary, they're coming back." She gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll finish what they started." More shots echoed through the timber closer now, followed by the sound of horses crashing through brush with violent purpose. 3 riders at least, maybe more, and they were searching with the methodical thoroughness of men who knew their deadly business well. Ohiteka did not hesitate. He slung his rifle across his back and lifted the wounded woman as carefully as urgency allowed, one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her back. She cried out softly as movement jarred her injuries, but there was no time for gentleness in this moment. "Hold tight to me," he said, his voice steady despite the approaching danger. Without conscious thought, she wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers finding desperate purchase in the beaded trim of his vest. Her breath came quick and ragged against his ear as he carried her toward the creek bank, where a dry wash cut deep into the hillside like a scar in the living earth. A bullet whined past them, chipping bark from a nearby aspen and sending white fragments spinning through the air like deadly snow. Ohiteka threw himself sideways, his body shielding hers as they slid down the wash in a cascade of loose gravel and choking dust. More shots followed in rapid succession, but these were wild, blind-fired by men who could not see their targets clearly through the screen of willows and dense brush. At the bottom of the wash, Ohiteka paused to listen, his breathing controlled while hers remained quick and shallow with shock. The hoofbeats moved along the ridge, searching with predatory patience. In the sudden quiet, he became acutely aware of how she fit against him, her slight frame trembling with blood loss and terror. Her arms had not loosened from around his neck, and when he glanced down, their faces were close enough for him to see gold flecks scattered through those frightened eyes. The moment stretched between them, raw fear in her gaze, steady calculation in his, creating an unexpected connection born of shared peril and desperate trust. She noticed the old scars that marked his forearms, pale lines against bronze skin that spoke of battles survived and enemies defeated. He saw the determined set of her jaw despite her terror and the desperate way she clutched a leather tube that must have been worth dying for. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above their labored breathing. "Ohiteka," he replied quietly. "And you are bleeding onto sacred ground, which means someone will answer for this." The horses were circling back toward them, and their riders growing bolder as they found no immediate sign of their quarry. He shifted his hold on her, bracing his forearm under her knees, and began moving through the wash toward the timber line, where ancient pines grew thick enough to hide an entire war party. "They want what I carry," she said, her voice gaining a thread of strength despite the pain that carved lines around her mouth. "They'll kill anyone who stands between them and it." Ohiteka did not ask. What lay in the leather tube, survival was the only question that mattered in this moment. He adjusted his hold, noting how she unconsciously pressed closer to him for warmth, as shock began to set in with cold fingers, and continued deeper into the forest, where his shelter waited beside Drought Creek. Behind them, rifle fire gradually faded into the distance, but the echo seemed to hang in the mountain air, like a promise that this deadly game was far from over. The shelter that served as Ohiteka's home sat in a small clearing where Drought Creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones worn by countless seasons of patient flow. Canvas stretched over sturdy lodge poles formed the main structure, with low log walls chinked tight with mud and prairie grass. Not beautiful by settlement standards, but practical in the way that kept a man alive, warm in winter, cool in summer, and easily moved if circumstances demanded swift departure. Nita looked up from tending the cook fire as he approached, carrying his unexpected burden, her 17-year-old face showing the sharp intelligence that marked their grandmother's bloodline. She wore a simple blue calico dress, traded from Fort Thompson's sutler with a beaded leather belt that proclaimed her heritage despite the white woman's clothing. "Cousin brings wounded birds instead of meat," she observed with characteristic bluntness, but she was already moving to help, pushing aside the door flap and spreading a soft buffalo robe inside the shelter. Ohiteka laid the woman down with infinite care, watching as she bit her lower lip to keep from crying out when her wounded shoulders settled against the thick hide. "Bullet wound," he told Nita in their own language. "Ankles twisted bad too. 3 riders were hunting her like wolves after a crippled doe." Hunting for what? Nita's dark eyes sharpened with interest and growing concern. "That remains to be discovered. To be..." The woman struggled to sit up despite the obvious pain, her movements showing the kind of stubborn determination that Ohiteka recognized and respected. "I'm Abigail," she said, her voice steadier now that immediate danger had passed. "Abigail Kozlov. My husband was Nikolai, but he..." She stopped, swallowing hard against grief that was still fresh as an open wound. "Fever took him last spring." Ohiteka nodded with understanding. Death from sickness was common enough on the frontier, where doctors were scarce and medicine even scarcer. "What did those men want from you?" Abigail's hand moved protectively to the leather tube she still clutched like a lifeline. "This. My husband's survey work. There's a homestead deed inside and maps. 160 acres under the Homestead Act, including the spring on Grey Wolf Knoll." The mention of Grey Wolf Knoll made Nita suck in a sharp breath of alarm. Ohiteka's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. The knoll was sacred ground, where the bones of their ancestors rested in the old way, according to traditions that reached back to the time before memory. It was also the source of the clearest, sweetest water for miles around, making it valuable to both peoples for vastly different reasons. "Who were the riders?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. "The one with the limp, they called him Grinning Tom. Works for Arthur Quill, who owns the copper mine down by Copper Gulch. They said..." She paused, her voice hardening with remembered anger. "They said the land wasn't for my kind, that I should take my foreign name back where it belonged and stop meddling in American business." Ohiteka knew Quill by his ugly reputation, a man who measured everything by its potential profit, including the desperate souls who worked his mine for wages that barely bought beans and hardtack. If Quill wanted Abigail's land, he saw money in it, and rich men rarely let scruples stand between them and what they coveted. "We tend your wounds first," Nita announced with practical authority, already heating water in a dented pot over the dancing flames. "Talk can wait until you're not bleeding all over my best buffalo robe." While his cousin worked with skilled hands, Ohiteka methodically checked his weapons with the thoroughness of a man whose life depended on their reliability. The Springfield was loaded with extra cartridges in a leather pouch on his belt. His bow hung from a wall-peg sinew string, still taut and ready for silent death. The bone-handled knife at his side had belonged to his father and his father before, that its edge maintained sharp enough to split hairs or slice through cartilage with equal ease. Nita cleaned the bullet wound with water, boiled with willow bark, the natural medicine helping prevent infection while easing pain. The bullet had passed through the flesh of Abigail's shoulder without striking bone, fortunate though the damage was still significant. The ankle proved less cooperative, badly sprained, but thankfully unbroken, requiring splinting with rawhide strips and split wood applied with gentle but firm precision. Throughout the painful procedure, Abigail never looked away from Ohiteka when the hurt became almost unbearable. He found himself studying her face with growing interest, noting the determination that kept her from crying out and the way she met his gaze steadily when Nita worked on the worst of the damage. When their eyes held, something passed between them, recognition that she possessed more strength than her appearance suggested, and that he respected such toughness in any creature, human or otherwise. "You're not safe out there," he said when Nita finished bandaging the wound with practiced efficiency. "Nor here," Abigail replied without reproach or self-pity. She understood with frontier clarity that helping her endangered them all. The sound of approaching horses froze them all in place, like deer sensing wolves. Ohiteka moved to the door flap with cat-like quiet, peering out to see 3 riders at the clearing's edge, too distant to make out faces clearly, but close enough to represent mortal danger. He slipped his knife from its sheath and pressed the bone handle into Abigail's palm, his fingers covering hers briefly to ensure her grip was secure. The contact sent unexpected warmth up his arm, and he saw her eyes widen slightly at the brief touch that somehow conveyed more than words could express. "If shooting starts," he said quietly, "you use this without hesitation." Nita handed Abigail a strip of jerky with matter-of-fact kindness, the gesture creating a small but significant alliance between the women. In Lakota tradition, offering food to a stranger meant acceptance, acknowledgement of welcome in their home, despite the dangers such hospitality might bring. As Ohiteka slipped outside to scout the riders with practiced stealth, Abigail found herself listening for his footsteps, even when she could not see him. Something about his presence made her feel safer than she had since Nikolai's death, a sense of competence and quiet strength that went beyond obvious physical capabilities. When she heard his moccasins whisper against pine needles as he circled the shelter's perimeter like a guardian spirit, her breathing seemed to steady in rhythm with his careful movements. The riders eventually moved on, without approaching closer, but not before one dismounted to examine tracks near the creek with the thoroughness of an experienced tracker. Ohiteka watched from concealment as the man, thin as a fence rail and wearing a hat banded with snakeskin, pointed toward the shelter and spoke words that made his companions laugh with unpleasant humor. When the immediate danger had passed, Ohiteka returned to find Abigail sitting straighter despite her injuries, the knife still ready in her hand. She had been prepared to fight if necessary, and that knowledge stirred something in him that had lain dormant since his wife's death 3 winters past. "They'll return," he told her with certainty. "But not tonight. Tonight we plan our next move." Abigail carefully opened the leather tube and withdrew its precious contents with hands that trembled only slightly. The first document was a standard homestead deed properly filed and witnessed in the territorial capital. But the second made her hands shake as she unrolled it, a detailed survey map drawn in Nikolai's careful hand, showing not just surface features, but geological formations hidden beneath the earth. A thick vein of copper ore ran directly under Grey Wolf Knoll's sacred spring, marked in red ink with notations about purity and estimated yield that would make any mining man's mouth water. According to the survey, it was one of the richest strikes Nikolai had ever documented in his years of professional work. "My husband trained as a surveyor in Russia before we came to America," Abigail explained, her voice tight with remembered pain. "He could read stone and soil like other men read newspapers. Quill hired him to map the area around his existing mine, looking for new veins to exploit. Nikolai found this one but never told Quill about it. Said it lay beneath ground that belonged to the spirits." Ohiteka nodded grimly, understanding the terrible irony. Under white law, Abigail's homestead claim granted rights to whatever lay beneath the surface. But the spring on Grey Wolf Knoll was sacred, where Lakota had honored their dead for generations beyond counting. Quill must have suspected something. She continued, her voice growing harder with each word. When Nikolai died, his men came searching for survey notes. I told them everything had burned with the fever clothes, but I'd hidden this. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the map. They believed me then. Somehow they learned I was heading to town to file the claim. As if summoned by her words, the acrid smell of smoke began drifting through the canvas walls, and flickering orange light danced between the trees like malevolent spirits seeking prey. The brush fire came with the deliberate malice of human design, creeping along Drought Creek's banks in 3 separate lines that would converge to trap anyone hiding in the timber. Ohiteka smelled smoke before he saw flames, recognizing immediately that this was no accident of nature or careless campfire. The scent carried the sharp tang of coal oil and murderous intent. Through the thickening smoke, 3 riders sat their mounts just beyond the fire line, silhouetted against orange flames like harbingers of judgment. Even at distance, he recognized the distinctive limp of grinning Tom, who favored his left leg even while mounted. The man's spurs caught firelight with each movement, and something about their design seemed hauntingly familiar, though he could not place why. "They mean to flush us out like rabbits from a warren," Nita whispered, appearing beside him with her own weapons ready. "No," Ohiteka replied, studying the riders' positions with tactical precision born of experience. "They hunt what she carries. The woman is just an inconvenience to be eliminated." Inside the shelter, Abigail had awakened and was pressing the leather tube against her chest like armor against fate. Her face showed pain and fear, but her eyes remained alert and calculating. "They won't stop coming," she said with grim certainty. "Quill needs this map to prove his mineral claims. Without it, he can't establish legal ownership of the copper beneath Grey Wolf Knoll." The fire was advancing steadily, forcing them to choose between fleeing into the open, where rifles waited, or being trapped by flames that would show no mercy. But Ohiteka had survived worse situations by thinking like prey while fighting like a predator. "There's a game trail upstream," he said, already gathering essential supplies with practiced efficiency. "Narrow, but it leads to high ground where fire can't follow. If we move now before full dawn, we might reach town without being spotted." "I can't ride," Abigail protested, gesturing toward her splinted ankle with obvious frustration. "You won't ride alone." He was already moving, saddling Nita's paint mare while his cousin packed their few valuables into a leather parfleche. The horse was sturdy and sensible, unlikely to panic in crisis, exactly what they needed for a desperate flight through hostile territory. As he lifted Abigail onto the mare's back, she gasped at the jarring pain, but made no sound of complaint. Her hands gripped the saddle horn with white-knuckled determination, and he noticed how she automatically adjusted her weight to favor the injured side, like a woman accustomed to hardship. "Hold steady," he told her, his hand resting briefly on her thigh to ensure she was secure in the saddle. The touch was practical, necessary, but something in the way she looked down at him suggested it was also something more significant. They moved along the game trail in pre-dawn darkness, Ohiteka walking beside the horse with one hand on the reins and the other ready to steady Abigail if she swayed. Smoke followed them for the first mile, acrid and choking. But gradually the air cleared as they climbed toward higher ground and safety. Behind them, frustrated shouts echoed as the riders discovered their empty shelter. One voice rose above the others, cursing with creative profanity that would have impressed a cavalry sergeant. That would be Tom. Ohiteka thought with grim satisfaction and smiled in the darkness like a wolf contemplating sheep. As the sun painted the eastern hills in shades of gold and crimson, Ohiteka made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of hiding until danger passed like frightened animals, they would go directly to Copper Gulch and expose Quill's crimes in broad daylight. But success would require help from someone in town who could not be bought intimidated or silenced through violence. Dr. Wilbur Hale was such a man, if reputation spoke truth. A physician who treated all patients equally regardless of race or ability to pay. Hale had earned respect that even Quill's considerable wealth could not tarnish or corrupt. If anyone could help them find justice in this God-forsaken territory, it would be him. "Can you make it to town?" Ohiteka asked as they paused beside a clear stream to rest and water the horse. Abigail looked down at him from the saddle, her face drawn with pain, but set with determination that reminded him of steel tempered in forge fire. "I can make it anywhere you're willing to take me." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Trust placed in his hands, like a sacred gift that must not be broken. As they resumed their journey toward Copper Gulch and whatever fate awaited there, neither noticed the lone rider who had been following their trail from a careful distance, staying just out of sight, but never falling too far behind. By the time they reached town's dusty outskirts, their shadow had already ridden ahead to carry word of their approach to the man who paid handsomely for such information. Morning sun climbed higher as they crossed open prairie that stretched between forested hills and Copper Gulch, painting grassland in shades of amber and burnished gold. Cottonwoods lined their route, where Willow Creek meandered toward the distant Cheyenne River leaves, already touched with autumn's first whispered promises. The air carried clean scents of sage and distant rain, though no clouds marred the crystalline dome of sky above them. Ohiteka walked steadily beside the mare, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of trouble with eyes that missed nothing important. The trail was well used, marked by wagon ruts and countless hoof prints that spoke of regular traffic between town and surrounding ranches. But it was also dangerously exposed, offering little cover if Quill's men chose to attack in broad daylight where witnesses might see. They were perhaps 2 miles from town when the wild boar exploded from tall grass beside the trail like fury given flesh and tusks. The animal was massive, easily 300 pounds of muscle and murderous rage, with yellowed tusks that could disembowel a man in seconds. Its small, hate-filled eyes fixed on horse and rider as it charged with the snorting bellow that had earned its kind their fearsome reputation across the frontier. The mare shied violently, nearly unseating Abigail, who cried out in pain as sudden movement jarred her wounded shoulder like fire. Ohiteka reacted without conscious thought, throwing himself sideways to intercept the boar's charge with complete disregard for his own safety. His shoulder struck the animal's flank with bone-jarring force, deflecting it away from the horse, but sending both man and beast rolling into grass that suddenly seemed inadequate protection against such primitive violence. The boar recovered first, its massive bulk wheeling with surprising agility that spoke of countless encounters with predators and hunters. It lowered its enormous head for another charge foam flecking its jaws like rabid spittle, and muscles bunching beneath coarse hide like steel cables under tension. Ohiteka rolled aside as razor-sharp tusks raked earth where he had been lying, then came up with his bone-handled knife gleaming wickedly in morning light. The beast lunged again, driven by primal fury that recognized no mercy or retreat. Ohiteka sidestepped at the last possible instant, his blade finding the soft spot behind the creature's massive shoulder where arteries ran close to the surface. Steel bit deep, opening a wound that sprayed dark blood across the grass in a crimson arc. The boar stumbled, but was far from finished, its wild intelligence burning in those small, vicious eyes like embers of hell itself. This time, he did not dodge or retreat. As the wounded animal charged with the desperate fury of a creature that knew it was dying, Ohiteka stepped directly into its path and drove his blade deep into the base of its thick neck, severing the major blood vessels that fed its brain. The boar's momentum carried it several more yards, its hooves churning earth to mud with blood, before it collapsed with earth-shaking finality. Ohiteka stood breathing hard, his shirt torn and blood-stained grass stains decorating his buckskin leggings like badges of mortal combat, When he looked up, he found Abigail staring with an expression he could not quite decipher. Shock was there, certainly, but also something else. Recognition of the deadly competence he had just displayed with such casual efficiency, and perhaps a glimpse of the violence that lay beneath his controlled exterior. "Are you hurt?" she asked, and genuine concern colored her voice in ways that surprised them both. "No," he replied, cleaning his knife on grass with methodical care before returning it to its sheath. "But we'll eat well tonight if we live to see evening." Despite everything danger stalking them, pain racking her body, uncertainty about what lay ahead, Abigail found herself laughing. It was a brief, breathless sound, but genuine as mountain air. The absurdity of worrying about dinner when armed men hunted them with professional determination struck her as both tragic and somehow perfectly reasonable. Ohiteka looked up in surprise, then felt his own mouth curve in what might have been a smile. The expression transformed his weathered face, softening harsh planes and making him appear younger, more approachable. For a moment, the warrior disappeared, and she glimpsed simply a man who had just saved her life and was quietly proud of having done so with such skill. That moment might have stretched longer, but rifle fire from the direction of town shattered the peaceful morning like glass. Two riders appeared on a distant ridge, smoke rising from their weapons in deliberate puffs. Bullets fell short of their position, but the message was unmistakably clear. They had been spotted, and enemies were closing in like wolves scenting blood. "Can you hold on?" Ohiteka asked, swinging up behind Abigail on the mare's back without waiting for permission. She nodded despite the movement making her wince with fresh pain. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, and she found herself pressed against his chest as he urged their mount into a ground-eating gallop. The position was intimate from sheer necessity, unmistakably close, and she could feel his heart's steady rhythm against her back, like a drum keeping time with her own accelerated pulse. They rode hard toward Copper Gulch hoofbeats, drumming against packed earth in a rhythm urgent as war drums. Behind them, the two riders gave determined pursuit, but their mounts proved no match for the paint horse's speed and endurance. By the time they reached town's dusty outskirts, their pursuers had fallen back to safer distance content, to follow and observe rather than engage in a running gun battle that might attract unwanted attention. Copper Gulch sprawled along both sides of Willow Creek, like children's blocks scattered by careless giant hands. Buildings were mostly wood-frame construction, with sod roofs built for function rather than beauty or comfort. A few boasted false fronts that made them appear more impressive than harsh reality, but most were honest structures that admitted their humble origins without shame. Main Street was unpaved, rutted by countless wagon wheels, and marked by the hoofprints of thousands of horses. A wooden sidewalk ran along the more prosperous businesses raised above the ever-present mud to keep customers' boots relatively clean. Signs hung from posts or were painted directly on weathered walls, advertising everything from hardware to legal services to liquid consolation. As Ohiteka rode down the main thoroughfare with Abigail in his protective embrace, townspeople stopped their morning activities to stare with undisguised curiosity. A Lakota warrior carrying a wounded white woman was not everyday entertainment, and the sight generated the kind of intense interest that small towns specialized in cultivating and spreading. Some stares were merely curious at the natural human fascination with anything unusual or dramatic, but others carried undercurrents of hostility that made Ohiteka's jaw tighten with controlled anger. Tensions between various peoples calling Dakota territory home never lay far beneath the surface, and many settlers viewed any Indian as a potential threat regardless of circumstances or character. He wore his status markers with quiet pride, the beaded vest that had been his wife's finest handiwork, the single eagle feather braided into his hair that marked him as a man of standing among his people. But he also knew these same symbols might be seen as provocation by those who had already judged his worth based on the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. Abigail felt the change in his posture as they rode deeper into town and the way his muscles tensed with controlled alertness. Her fingers tightened in his shirt's fringe, a gesture both protective and possessive. Whatever these narrow-minded people thought of him, she knew what he had done for her, and their prejudice would not go unchallenged while she drew breath. They were approaching the doctor's office when Sheriff Laurent Decker stepped from beneath the jail's shading awning like a spider emerging from its web. He was a tall man, gone soft around the middle, his badge pinned to a vest that strained across his considerable belly. Pale eyes fixed on Ohiteka with the kind of predatory attention a hawk might give a rabbit. "That's far enough, boy." Decker called out his hand, resting with deliberate menace on his revolver's butt. Ohiteka brought the mare to a halt, arms still encircling Abigail with protective determination. He could feel hostile eyes upon them townspeople gathering to watch what seemed like inevitable confrontation. In his arms, Abigail shifted slightly, and he was acutely aware of how fragile she felt, despite the steel he sensed in her spine. "The lady needs medical attention." Ohiteka said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, without a trace of the deference Decker obviously expected. "The lady," Decker replied with deliberate, insulting emphasis. "Looks like she's been through considerable trouble. Question is, who caused it?" The implication hung in the air, like smoke from green wood, poisonous and choking. Ohiteka felt familiar anger begin burning in his chest. But before he could respond with words that might escalate the situation dangerously, Abigail spoke up. "This man saved my life," she declared loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear every syllable clearly. "If you're looking for someone to blame for my condition, I suggest you ask Arthur Quill where his men were yesterday afternoon when decent folks were about their business." Mention of Quill's name caused a visible stir among the onlookers, and Ohiteka noticed several meaningful glances exchanged between people who clearly knew more than they were willing to say publicly. It seemed the mine owner's reputation was not entirely spotless, even among his own people. Decker's expression hardened like winter ice, but he stepped aside with obvious reluctance. "Doc Hale's office is 2 doors down," he said through gritted teeth. "But I'll be wanting words with both of you once the lady's been properly seen to. Don't think about leaving town before we have that little conversation." The threat was unmistakable, but they had no choice except to comply. As they moved toward the physician's office, Ohiteka became aware of how Abigail's breathing had steadied against his chest, how her grip on his shirt had relaxed now that immediate confrontation had passed without violence. The awareness of her trust, the way she unconsciously leaned into his strength, created warmth that had nothing to do with morning sunshine, and everything to do with something he was not yet ready to name. Dr. Wilbur Hale's office occupied the ground floor of a sturdy building that also housed the town's one-room school. The physician himself appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and hands that moved with the assured competence born of long experience, treating everything from gunshot wounds to difficult births. His eyes, magnified slightly by wire-rimmed spectacles, held the kind of steady intelligence that inspired confidence, even in desperate circumstances. Maud Henley, who served as both the doctor's assistant and the town's school teacher, helped Abigail onto the examination table with gentle efficiency that spoke of considerable practice. She was a spinster woman of perhaps 40, with steel-gray hair pinned in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing important. Her hands, like the doctor's, moved with practiced skill as she began cutting away the makeshift bandages Nita had applied with such careful precision. "Bullet wound," Dr. Hale observed, probing the injury with careful fingers that brought gasps of pain despite his gentle touch. "Clean entry and exit, no bone damage I can detect. You're fortunate, Mrs. Kozlov," Abigail replied through gritted teeth, white lines appearing around her mouth as she fought against the pain. Abigail Kozlov. Yes, I heard about your husband's passing some months back. Hale's voice carried genuine sadness that caught Ohiteka's attention. Nikolai was a good man, one of the finest surveyors I ever knew. We shared many evenings discussing geology and the future of this territory. My sincere condolences on your loss. The revelation that Dr. Hale had known Nikolai personally added new weight to the situation. Ohiteka could see the physician's jaw tighten with what looked like suppressed anger as he began cleaning the wound with carbolic acid. This will sting considerably. Hale continued, his voice harder now. But it's absolutely necessary to prevent infection. I've seen too many good people die from wounds that should have healed properly. While the doctor worked with professional concentration, Ohiteka stood by the window, ostensibly watching the street, but actually studying people who passed by with the systematic thoroughness of a man whose life depended on reading potential threats. He had pulled the Q-marked spur from his pocket at the piece of metal he had snagged from a tree branch during their desperate escape from the brush fire. The marking was clear and distinctive, a stylized letter that could only belong to someone connected with Quill's mining operation. "Doctor," he said, turning from the window with the spur held where everyone could see it clearly. "What do you know of the man called Grinning Tom?" Hale's hands never paused in their careful work, but his expression grew deeply troubled. "Tom Briggs is a man who sells his gun to whoever pays the highest price. A killer, plain and simple. Last I heard, he was working for Arthur Quill, doing jobs that require more muscle than brains and fewer scruples than most decent folks possess. He wears spurs marked with this," Ohiteka said, displaying the Q-branded metal with its telltale scratches and wear patterns. Maud looked up from preparing fresh bandages, her face darkening with recognition and growing concern. "I saw him riding out yesterday afternoon with 2 other men I didn't recognize. Hard-looking types with a smell of trouble about them. They were heading toward the hills, and they had the look of men about serious business." "What kind of business?" Abigail asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would not be pleasant. "The kind that usually ends with someone getting hurt or worse." Hale replied grimly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had treated too many victims of frontier violence. He finished bandaging her shoulder and moved to examine her ankle with the same careful attention. "This is badly sprained, but not broken. You'll need to stay completely off it for several days at minimum." It was then that Abigail revealed the contents of her precious leather tube, spreading Nikolai's survey map on the doctor's desk, where everyone could see the careful notations marking the copper vein beneath Grey Wolf Knoll. The homestead deed lay beside it, properly witnessed and bearing official seals that made it legally binding under territorial law. "This is what they wanted," she explained, her voice hardening with remembered fear and growing anger. "Quill hired my husband to survey the area around his existing mine, but Nikolai found something Quill wasn't supposed to know about. When Nikolai died, I inherited the land and everything beneath it, according to federal homestead law." Dr. Hale studied the map with growing interest and obvious alarm, his face growing pale as he recognized his friend's careful handwriting. "If this survey is accurate, and knowing Nikolai's thoroughness, I have no reason to doubt it, you're sitting on a considerable fortune in copper ore. No wonder Quill wants you gone permanently rather than merely discouraged." "The claim filing opens tomorrow morning," Abigail said with determination that made her jaw set in hard lines. "If I can reach the land office and register the deed officially, the mineral rights, which are not conveyed by homestead surface title and may be separately claimed under the federal mining law of 1872, become mine under federal law, and there's nothing Quill can do about it legally." "And if you can't make it there alive?" Maud asked quietly. "Then Quill can claim the land was abandoned and file his own homestead application. With Nikolai dead, and me supposedly fled back east, in fear there would be no one left to contest his claim in territorial court. The sound of approaching horses made them all look toward the window with growing apprehension. 3 riders had stopped directly in front of the office, and even through glass, the lead rider's considerable bulk and expensive clothing marked him as a man of substantial importance and influence. Arthur Quill had come calling personally, which meant the situation was about to become significantly more dangerous. Lock that map in your strongbox immediately. Ohiteka told Dr. Hale, urgency sharpening his voice to a blade's edge. Hale moved with surprising speed for a man of his years, securing the precious documents in an iron box bolted securely to the floor behind his desk. The strongbox was fireproof and designed to protect important papers from both accident and deliberate theft, exactly the kind of precaution a frontier doctor would take with medical records and other sensitive documents that could mean life or death. When Quill entered moments later with his usual theatrical flair, he found them arranged in apparent innocence. The doctor tending his patient with professional competence, the Indian, standing quietly by the window like a statue, and Maud cleaning instruments with studious concentration that fooled no one. Arthur Quill was a man who had never learned to disguise his appetites effectively, and middle age had only made him more obvious in his greed. His clothes were expensive but ill-fitting, stretched across a frame that spoke of too many rich meals and insufficient honest work. When he smiled, which he did often, and without warmth, his teeth showed too white and too perfect to be entirely natural. Pale eyes moved constantly around the room, cataloging everything as if calculating potential value with the instincts of a born predator. Behind him stood Tom Briggs, still limping from some old injury, and a third man, whose weathered face bore the kind of scars that came from violent living and violent dying. But it was Quill himself who commanded attention, radiating the kind of casual menace that came from never having to answer for his actions. "Mrs. Kozlov." Quill said, his voice carrying false concern, wrapped around a core of steel. "I heard you'd been hurt out there in the wilderness. Terrible thing, a woman alone in such dangerous country. Accidents happen so easily when one ventures into places where one doesn't belong." The subtle threat was wrapped in silk, but it was no less deadly for its polite delivery. Abigail felt ice form in her stomach, but she kept her voice steady as she replied. "I found adequate protection," she said, glancing toward Ohiteka with unmistakable meaning and growing defiance. Quill's pale eyes followed her gaze, and his expression shifted subtly like a mask, slipping for just an instant. "Yes, I can see that clearly enough. Though I wonder if you've chosen your protectors as wisely as you might believe. Savages can be quite unpredictable in their loyalties, especially when financial incentives enter the equation." The insult was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to saying whatever he pleased without consequence. Ohiteka gave no outward sign that it had registered, but Dr. Hale noticed how his hand had moved slightly closer to his knife handle in a gesture that spoke of considerable self-control. "What brings you here today, Mr. Quill?" Hale asked, his tone professionally neutral, but carefully controlled in a way that suggested deeper currents of anger running beneath the surface. "Just checking on Mrs. Kozlov's welfare, naturally." Quill replied with practiced smoothness that came from years of lying to people's faces. "I understand she inherited some land from her late husband. Poor soil, mostly nothing but rock and scrub brush. Hardly worth the considerable effort of farming, but I might be willing to make her a generous offer for it. Save her the trouble and expense of trying to work a claim that's bound to fail in this harsh country." "How generous of you," Abigail said, her voice level despite anger burning in her chest like banked coals. "But I think I'll hold on to my husband's legacy for the time being." Quill's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold as winter ice. Of course, of course. Take all the time you need to consider my generous offer carefully. Though I should mention that the area has become quite dangerous lately. Bandits, wild animals, accidents of all kinds. It would be tragic if anything happened to such a lovely young widow, especially one who's already suffered so much loss. The threat was beautifully crafted, delivered with the kind of polite menace that left no fingerprints, but conveyed the message with perfect clarity. But as he spoke, Quill's hungry gaze kept drifting toward the strongbox where Hale had secured the survey map, and Ohitekka noticed the naked avarice burning in those pale eyes, like fever. I'll keep that wise advice in mind, Abigail said with deceptive mildness that hid a growing resolve to fight this man with every resource at her disposal. After Quill and his men departed with theatrical reluctance, tension remained thick in the office like smoke that refused to clear. Through the window, they could see the three riders engaged in low, intense conversation near the hitching post, their eyes occasionally returning to the doctor's building with obvious calculation and growing impatience. He knows about the map, Maud said quietly, speaking the truth they all recognized, but none wanted to acknowledge directly. You could see knowledge written plain across his greedy face. Then we have to get those documents to the land office before he can stop us, Abigail replied with determination that made her voice ring like steel on steel. Filing doesn't open until tomorrow morning at the earliest, Dr. Hale pointed out with growing concern. That gives Quill considerable time to make another move, and he's not a man known for his patience when money is involved. Ohitekka turned from the window, his expression grim with hard-earned certainty. He'll try for the map tonight when darkness gives him cover. Men like that don't wait when they can smell money, and rich men have no patience for obstacles. As if summoned by his prophetic words, Sheriff Decker appeared in the doorway like a bad omen, his considerable bulk filling the frame and his hand resting with casual menace on his gun butt. I need to speak with the Indian about some serious matters, he announced without preamble or courtesy. Got some pointed questions about what happened out there in the hills yesterday. His name is Ohitekka, Abigail said sharply, steel entering her voice like a blade being drawn. And whatever questions you have can be asked in front of witnesses who can verify what's said here. Decker's pale eyes shifted to her with something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so cold. And then back to Ohitekka with obvious calculation. Fair enough, I suppose. Word around town is you attacked some of Mr. Quill's men yesterday, without any provocation whatsoever. Assaulted them in cold blood while they were going about their lawful business. Word around town is wrong, Ohitekka replied with calm certainty that brooked no argument. They shot Mrs. Kozlov in cold blood and left her beside Willow Creek to die like a wounded animal. I found her and brought her to safety, nothing more and nothing less. Got any proof of that serious accusation against respected members of this community? Ohitekka showed him the Q-marked spur, explaining precisely where he had found it and under what circumstances, providing details that only someone who had actually been there could know. But Decker barely glanced at the evidence before dismissing it with a careless shrug that spoke of predetermined conclusions. Could have come from anywhere at all. Could have been planted there for all I know. Your word against theirs, and they're respected members of this community who pay their taxes regular and contribute to local prosperity. The bias was so blatant that even Dr. Hale appeared genuinely shocked. Laurent, you've known me for 15 years. Are you actually suggesting I would lie about Mrs. Kozlov's injuries or participate in some elaborate deception? I'm not suggesting anything at all, Doc. Just doing my sworn duty, asking the questions that need asking. but Decker's tone suggested he had already reached his conclusions, regardless of any answers or evidence presented. As the sheriff departed with obvious reluctance, Ohiteka moved to secure the window latch, his movements automatic, but telling in their defensive nature. Abigail watched him work, noting how he positioned himself instinctively between her and any potential threat, the unconscious protectiveness that seemed as natural to him as breathing. "You don't have to stay here and risk your life," she told him quietly when they were relatively alone. "This isn't your fight, and you've already done more than enough for a stranger." He turned to look at her directly, and for a moment, their eyes held across the small room, with perfect understanding passing between them like electricity. "My word is not yet kept," he said, simply, the formal phrasing making it sound like a sacred oath. "You are not yet safe, and until you are, I remain." The promise was simple in its words, but profound in its implications, carrying the weight of a binding commitment rather than a casual offer of temporary assistance. Abigail felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with growing awareness that this man was unlike anyone she had ever known. Outside shadows were lengthening as evening approached with its promise of darkness and danger. Soon the sun would set, and night in Copper Gulch belonged to men like Arthur Quill and his hired guns. But inside the doctor's office, with the survey map locked safely away, and Ohiteka standing guard like a sentinel, Abigail felt safer than she had since Nikolai's death. She did not yet understand that safety was merely an illusion, and that the night ahead would test all of them in ways none could imagine. Night descended on Copper Gulch like a predator stalking wounded prey, bringing with it the kind of darkness that seemed to encourage the worst impulses of desperate and greedy men. Ohiteka had positioned himself near the front window of Dr. Hale's office, where he could observe the street without being easily seen from outside. His rifle lay across his knees, loaded and ready, while his knife rested within easy reach like a faithful companion. Abigail dozed fitfully on the examination table, her face peaceful in lamplight, for the first time since he had found her beside Willow Creek. The lines of pain and fear that had marked her features were smoothed away by exhausted sleep, revealing the natural beauty that hardship had temporarily masked. Maud had remained after her usual hours, partly to assist with the patient, but mostly because she sensed trouble approaching like a gathering storm. Dr. Hale worked at his desk, but his attention kept drifting to the strongbox where Nikolai's survey map lay protected by iron and steel, yet still vulnerable to men who measured everything in terms of profit and loss rather than human decency. The physician's movements were restless, agitated, and Ohiteka could see the grief and anger warring in the older man's face. "You knew him well," Ohiteka observed quietly, his voice barely disturbing the night air. Hale looked up, his spectacles reflecting lamplight. "Nikolai Kozlov was the finest man I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Brilliant, honest, dedicated to his work and his wife. We spent countless evenings discussing the geology of this region, planning ways to help settlers find good water and avoid the worst ground." His hands clenched into fists. "If I'd known what Quill was planning." "You couldn't have known," Abigail said softly, having awakened during their conversation. Nikolai never suspected either until it was too late. The first sign of serious trouble came as a rhythmic scratching from the building's rear, like mice in the walls, but too regular and purposeful to be natural. Ohiteka held up his hand for absolute silence, then moved with cat-like quiet toward the back door. Through the small window, he could see shadowy figures working in the alley with metal tools, their movements coordinated and professional. "They're trying to break in from behind," he whispered to Dr. Hale with urgent intensity. The physician's face went white with sudden realization. "The strongbox. They think they can reach it from the back room without being seen from the street." But Ohiteka was already moving with deadly purpose, his hand finding Abigail's shoulder to wake her gently from her desperately needed rest. "We need to hide you immediately," he said quietly. She came awake instantly, frontier survival instincts, allowing her to assess the dangerous situation without panic or wasted time. "Where can I go?" "The supply closet," Maud suggested, indicating a narrow door beside the examination table. "It's not much protection, but it's better than remaining in the open." As Ohiteka helped Abigail into the cramped space, his hand covered her mouth briefly to emphasize the absolute need for silence that might mean the difference between life and death. The contact was necessary and practical, but the warmth of his palm against her lips sent an unexpected jolt through both of them. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, their eyes met in the confined space, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with current danger and everything to do with growing feelings neither was ready to acknowledge. Then the sound of splintering wood from the back room broke the spell like a gunshot, and Ohiteka was moving again, positioning himself where he could defend both the closet and the strongbox with maximum effectiveness. Two men came through the broken door faces, masked with bandanas, but builds unmistakably familiar from earlier encounters. One moved like Tom Briggs, favoring his left leg, even while carrying burglary tools with practiced ease. The other had the lean build of someone accustomed to hard, violent living on the wrong side of territorial law. They carried crowbars and chisels, implements specifically designed for breaking into secure places and taking what did not belong to them. Ohiteka allowed them to enter the room fully before acting with explosive violence. His first blow took the lean man in the temple with surgical precision, dropping him like a felled tree. The second caught Tom Briggs as he turned toward the sound, doubling him over with a punch to the solar plexus that left him gasping desperately for precious air. But Tom proved tougher than his appearance suggested, managing to swing his crowbar in a vicious arc that would have crushed Ohiteka's skull if it had connected properly. Instead, it struck the wall with a sound like breaking bones, gouging deep into wood and sending dangerous splinters flying in all directions. The fight that followed was brief but viciously intense, conducted in near silence to avoid attracting attention from the street where other ears might be listening. Tom was skilled with his improvised weapon, using the crowbar like a war club, with considerable expertise. But Ohiteka possessed the crucial advantages of speed and combat experience earned in battles where losing meant death rather than mere defeat. When it ended with brutal finality, Tom lay unconscious beside his companion, both men breathing but thoroughly defeated and unlikely to cause further trouble for several hours. Maud had appeared during the fight with a heavy chamber pot in her hands, ready to brain anyone who threatened her patients, though her intervention proved unnecessary. "Should we bind them securely?" Dr. Hale suggested, but Ohiteka shook his head with tactical wisdom. "Better they wake and report failure to their employer. If they disappear entirely, Quill will send more men, and we won't know they're coming until it's too late to prepare." It was then, as they checked the strongbox to ensure it remained undamaged and secure, that Dr. Hale made the discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Hidden beneath his medical ledger was a second set of books when he kept his insurance against the day when someone might question his financial accounts or attempt to strong-arm him. "I always keep detailed records of debts owed," he explained, opening the leather-bound volume with hands that trembled slightly. "In a place like this, you learn to protect yourself from people who think medical bills don't require payment. But sometimes these records reveal more than just money owed." The page that captured their horrified attention bore Arthur Quill's name, and it told a story none of them had expected or prepared for. The careful entries revealed not just financial transactions, but a pattern of corruption and violence that went back months. Listed under Quill's account were payments for ammunition specifically. 44 to 40 cartridges with flat-nosed bullets identical to the one that had wounded Abigail. medical supplies for treating gunshot wounds purchased weeks before any legitimate need could have existed. Payments to LD for special services rendered consistently over many months. And most revealing of all, a notation about custom spurs bearing the letter Q, ordered for LD brother, matching pair. LD, Maud said quietly, understanding dawning in her voice like a terrible sunrise. Laurent Decker. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Dr. Hale turned more pages searching for additional evidence, they found an entry that made Abigail's blood turn to ice in her veins. Listed under Special Medical Services, LD, was a payment dated just 2 days after Nikolai's death, with a notation that chilled them all. NK, fever treatment, special preparation, final consultation. Sweet Mary. Abigail whispered her hand, flying to her throat as the horrible truth became clear. They didn't just want the map. They killed Nikolai to get it, and when they couldn't find it, they came after me. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption and murder that went far deeper than simple greed or business rivalry. Decker was not merely on Quill's payroll. He was family connected by blood as well as corruption. And Nikolai's death from fever had been anything but natural. It had been carefully orchestrated murder disguised as illness, with the sheriff providing both the means and the cover-up. Brothers. Dr. Hale said, his voice hollow with horror as he studied the blood relationship notations in his files. They share the same rare blood condition I've treated in both of them. Arthur and Laurent Decker, they're brothers, and they've been planning this for months. The revelation hit them like physical blows. Not only was the law corrupted in Copper Gulch, but it was corrupted by family loyalty, twisted into something monstrous. The sheriff, who was supposed to protect citizens, was actually part of a murder conspiracy, and his badge made him almost untouchable. This changes everything we thought we knew, Dr. Hale said, staring at the damning evidence with growing horror. With this, we can prove Decker's been compromised from the very beginning. We can show that Quill's been planning murder for months with his own brother providing legal protection. But even as he spoke those words, they could hear boots on the front porch, accompanied by voices they recognized with sinking hearts. Decker was approaching, probably alerted by the noise of the fight, and he was not alone. The sound of multiple footsteps suggested he had brought reinforcements, which meant their situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. Ohiteka quickly helped Abigail back into the supply closet, his movements urgent but infinitely gentle. As she settled into the cramped space, their shoulders pressed together in the confined area, she found herself acutely aware of his warmth, of the steady rhythm of his breathing, that seemed to calm her own racing heart despite the mortal peril they faced. Whatever happens out there, he whispered, his breath warm against her ear in the darkness. Stay hidden until I come for you personally. Trust no one else, no matter what they might say or promise. The promise was simple, but it carried the weight of a sacred oath that she knew he would keep or die trying. As the closet door closed and darkness enveloped her like a protective shroud, then Abigail found herself trusting absolutely in his ability to keep that promise, even though she had known him for less than 3 full days. Outside the closet, she could hear Decker's voice loud and suspicious as he questioned Dr. Hale about the unconscious men in the back room. The sheriff's explanation was smooth and practiced, but Abigail could detect underlying tension that suggested he knew far more about the night's events than he was admitting to anyone. Looks like someone tried to rob you, Doc, Decker was saying with false concern that wouldn't have fooled a child. Good thing you had help dealing with the situation before they could steal anything valuable. Yes, Dr. Hale replied carefully, understanding the dangerous game they were all playing. Very fortunate indeed that help was available when needed. But the most chilling moment came when she heard Decker's voice drop to a whisper, speaking to someone else in the room. "Any sign of what we're really looking for?" "Nothing obvious?" came the reply in a voice she didn't recognize. But the night's still young. In the darkness of the supply closet, listening to voices that carried the promise of death, Abigail finally grasped the full scope of what they faced. This was not simply about greed or even land rights. It was about family loyalty, twisted into something monstrous, about the fundamental corruption of justice itself, and about the kind of systematic evil that could destroy entire communities if left unchecked. But she also understood something else, something that gave her hope despite overwhelming odds and mortal danger. Ohiteka had not abandoned her. When the true scope of the danger became clear, had not calculated the risks, and decided she was not worth the potential cost to his own life. Whatever his reasons, he had chosen to stand with her against forces that could destroy them both, and that knowledge was more precious than gold. Dawn brought no relief from the oppressive sense of danger that had settled over Copper Gulch like smoke from a grass fire that refused to die completely. Word of the failed break-in had spread through town with the supernatural speed that only bad news could achieve. And by the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, everyone knew that Mrs. Kozlov and her Indian protector had become targets in a game far deadlier than anyone had previously imagined possible. Sheriff Decker made no effort to arrest Tom Briggs or his companion, despite Dr. Hale's formal complaint about the attempted burglary filed in proper legal fashion. Instead, he seemed more interested in questioning the physician about his vigilante activities and the impropriety of harboring a dangerous savage in a medical facility where decent people came for treatment. The message was unmistakably clear to anyone. With eyes to see, official protection would not be forthcoming from any quarter, and they were entirely on their own. Arthur Quill, meanwhile, had not remained idle during the dark hours when honest folks slept. By morning, professionally printed wanted posters had appeared on buildings throughout town, like a plague of paper locusts, offering a substantial $50 reward for information leading to the capture of the Indian known as Ohiteka, for the alleged kidnapping of Mrs. Abigail Kozlov, a respectable widow. The posters made no mention of her injuries or the circumstances that had brought them together, painting instead a carefully crafted picture of an innocent woman held against her will by a savage who intended her grave harm. $50 represented more money than most frontier workers saw in 6 months of backbreaking labor, and the effect was immediate and predictable as sunrise. Suddenly, every man in town was studying Ohiteka with calculating eyes, measuring risk against potential reward, with the cold precision of professional gamblers weighing odds. "We can't remain here safely," Maud said, speaking the obvious truth none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. "By tonight, half the men in town will be drunk on whiskey and Dutch courage, looking to collect that bounty money and buy themselves a stake for the future. The land office doesn't open for filing until tomorrow morning at the earliest." Dr. Hale pointed out with growing anxiety. "Where can they possibly go that will be safe for that long with every greedy man in the territory hunting them?" It was Ohiteka who provided the answer, though he did so with obvious reluctance and considerable reservation. "There's a place by the river downstream from town. Old trapper's cabin, mostly fallen down now, but the root cellar is still sound and dry. We could hide there until morning comes and the office opens." The plan appeared simple in concept, but would prove dangerous in execution with deadly consequences if they made even small mistakes. They would have to leave town without being observed by hostile eyes, transport the strongbox containing vital documents, and somehow survive in the wilderness for another full day, while Quill's men and bounty hunters scoured the countryside, searching for them with methodical thoroughness. But as they prepared for departure with careful planning, disaster struck from an entirely unexpected direction that none of them had anticipated. The first sign of serious trouble came as the distant sound of gunfire from the river's direction, followed by shouts and the thunder of horses running at full gallop. Through the window, they could see thick smoke rising from what appeared to be the exact area where Ohiteka had planned to take them for concealment and safety. Someone systematically burning out all the hiding places, he said grimly, studying the smoke with tactical awareness born of experience. They're driving us into the open like rabbits from a warren, exactly as they did with the brush fire. The realization struck them all simultaneously. With the force of physical blows, Quill had not simply hired local thugs for this operation. He had brought in professionals, men who understood how to conduct systematic hunts and who would not be deterred by sentiment, weather, or basic human decency in their pursuit of blood money. Rattler's crew. Dr. Hale said, his face draining of color as the implications became clear. I heard rumors they were operating somewhere in the territory, but I never believed Quill would actually hire them for something like this. Who exactly is Rattler? Abigail asked, though she suspected the answer would be deeply unpleasant. Jake Rattler. Outlaw killer, and the kind of man who would burn down an orphanage full of children if the price was right and the pay was guaranteed. If Quill has hired his crew, then this situation has escalated far beyond anything we can handle with local resources alone. The sound of approaching horses made the decision for them with brutal finality that allowed no room for debate or hesitation. Through the window, they could observe at least 6 riders entering town from the east, their faces hard and weapons prominently displayed for maximum intimidation. These were not local men hoping to earn easy money, and these were professional killers who had traveled far to finish what Tom Briggs had started and botched. The root cellar under the church. Maud suggested, desperately grasping at straws. Father Mackenzie might provide sanctuary if we ask properly. Too obvious, Ohiteka replied with certainty born of experience. They'll check every building in town systematically, and a priest's protection won't stop bullets or fire. It was then that nature itself seemed to take a direct hand in their survival, as if the very elements had decided to intervene on behalf of justice. Thunder rolled across the Dakota hills like artillery fire, followed by lightning that split the sky like the wrath of angry gods, and rain that descended in sheets so thick, visibility dropped to mere yards. The storm struck with the sudden violence that characterized prairie weather, transforming the world into a realm of water and wind and elemental fury. Now, Ohiteka said, understanding immediately that the storm was both precious opportunity and additional mortal danger. We move now while they can't see us clearly, and the rain covers our tracks. The journey to the riverbank became a nightmare of mud lightning and constant fear of discovery by enemies who would show no mercy if they found their quarry. Hale had insisted on accompanying them despite his age, arguing that they would need medical supplies if anyone sustained serious injury. And Maud had flatly refused to remain behind to face Quill's questions about their whereabouts, when she knew nothing that could satisfy his murderous curiosity. They moved in single file through the storm, Ohiteka, leading with Abigail close behind him, her hand on his belt to avoid losing contact, in the driving rain that turned the world into a gray nightmare. The strongbox, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect its precious contents, seemed to grow heavier with each step. But none of them suggested abandoning the documents that represented their only hope of legal protection and justice. It was while crossing a rain-swollen creek that disaster struck again with cruel and arbitrary timing. Nita, who had joined them at the last possible minute against her cousin's explicit wishes and better judgment, slipped on the treacherous, muddy bank and fell hard against a fallen cottonwood tree. The crack of breaking bone was audible even above the storm's fury. And when Ohiteka reached her, he found her collarbone snapped cleanly and her face white with shock and agony. Leave me here." She gasped through gritted teeth, but he was already lifting her with infinite care, mindful of the injury that could prove fatal if handled incorrectly. "We don't abandon family," he said simply, and the finality in his voice ended all argument or discussion. It was Abigail who solved the immediate problem of shelter, her eyes spotting a stand of cedar trees, whose thick, overlapping branches formed a natural windbreak against the storm's relentless fury. While Ohiteka splinted Nita's injury with strips torn from his own shirt, Abigail and Maud gathered pine boughs to create a crude but surprisingly effective shelter that would protect them from the worst of the elements. The work brought them closer together, both literally and figuratively, in ways that went beyond mere physical proximity. As they arranged the branches with desperate efficiency, Abigail found herself working in perfect coordination with Ohiteka, anticipating his needs and responding to unspoken directions as if they had been partners for years rather than days. When he needed something, her hand was there to provide it without being asked. When she struggled with a particularly heavy branch, his strength was immediately available to assist without making her feel helpless or incompetent. Dr. Hale, meanwhile, was examining the strongbox with growing alarm and mounting despair. The fall into the swollen creek had damaged the lock mechanism severely, and water had seeped inside despite their precautions, threatening the documents they had fought so desperately to protect from Quill's grasping hands. "The original map is completely ruined," he said, showing them ink that had run and blurred beyond any possibility of recognition or use. "But I made detailed copies in my medical journal, and those pages are still intact and readable, thank the Lord." The relief was overwhelming, but proved tragically short-lived as reality intruded once again. Through the rain, they could hear the sound of horses and human voices growing steadily closer, despite the weather that should have provided perfect concealment. Rattler's men were conducting a systematic search of the area, and they were not being deterred by the harsh conditions that would have stopped lesser men. As they huddled together under the cedar shelter, waiting for mortal danger to pass them by, Abigail became acutely aware of Ohiteka's presence beside her, in ways that went far beyond simple physical proximity. They sat back to back for warmth and mutual support, their breathing gradually synchronizing as they tried to remain perfectly quiet and invisible. She could feel the steady beat of his heart through his wet shirt and the solid strength of his shoulders pressed against hers like an anchor in the storm. In the darkness and driving rain, with professional killers hunting them through the tempest like wolves tracking wounded prey, she found herself thinking not about the copper mine or the homestead claim that had brought them to this desperate pass, but about the man who had risked absolutely everything to keep her safe. The realization that her feelings had grown far beyond simple gratitude should have terrified her in such circumstances. But instead, it brought a strange sense of completeness, as if something that had been missing from her life had finally been found. When Ohiteka's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining naturally and without hesitation or self-consciousness, she did not pull away or question the propriety. Instead, she held on tightly, drawing strength from the contact and hoping desperately that he could feel the same reassurance flowing back to him through their joined hands. "Abigail," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it beneath the storm's fury, his voice carrying emotions he had not allowed himself to feel since his wife's death. "I know," she whispered back, understanding, without need for more words, what they were both feeling in this moment, suspended between life and death. "I know, and I feel the same." The storm eventually passed, as all storms must, but the danger remained as real and immediate as ever. Somewhere out there in the darkness, professional killers were hunting them with the patience and skill of men who had never failed to bring down their prey and collect their blood money. Tomorrow would bring the opportunity to file the homestead claim and expose Quill's crimes. But first they had to survive the night that stretched endlessly before them, like an eternity of fear and uncertainty. As dawn approached with agonizing slowness, Abigail realized that her definition of survival had fundamentally changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. It was no longer sufficient to simply stay alive. She needed Ohiteka to survive as well. Needed it with an intensity that surprised her with its desperate strength and absolute certainty. Whatever happened at the land office, whatever the uncertain future held in store for them, she knew with complete conviction that she wanted him to be part of it. The morning of the land office filing dawned clear and brutally cold, with frost painting the grass silver and the kind of sharp air that made every breath visible like whispered prayers to an indifferent heaven. Copper Gulch stirred to reluctant life, as if the town itself sensed that this day would bring violence and bloodshed, and was reluctant to begin the deadly dance that seemed inevitable. The land office occupied a narrow building on Main Street, wedged between Peterson's General Store and the Lucky Dollar Saloon that had not yet opened for the day's business of separating fools from their money. A small but growing crowd had already gathered outside, despite the early-hour homesteaders and speculators waiting for their chance to claim pieces of Dakota territory for their own families and futures. Most carried rolled papers and wore the nervous excitement of people betting their entire lives on government promises that might prove worthless. But scattered among the legitimate claimants were faces that Ohiteka recognized from wanted posters and the previous night's hunt through the storm. Rattler's men had positioned themselves strategically throughout the area with military precision, some lounging against buildings with deceptive casualness, others sitting horses at the crowd's edge like wolves watching sheep. They made no effort to hide their presence or intentions, confident in their numbers and fearsome reputation that had been earned through years of successful violence. Arthur Quill stood near the front of the line, his considerable bulk unmistakable, even in morning shadows that seemed to cling to him like smoke. Beside him was Tom Briggs, his face still bearing vivid marks from his encounter with Ohiteka, and two other men whose hard faces and watchful eyes marked them as professional trouble imported from distant places where life was cheap and death was cheaper. 12 hours, Dr. Hale said quietly, checking his pocket watch with obvious anxiety that made his hands tremble slightly. The office remains open until sunset, but I suspect Mr. Quill will attempt to end this long before then, one way or another. They had spent the pre-dawn hours in the church basement, where Father Mackenzie had provided sanctuary, despite obvious and immediate danger to himself and his entire congregation. The elderly priest had taken one look at Abigail's injuries and Nita's makeshift splint, then declared that Christian charity trumped any temporal concerns about bounty hunters and corrupt sheriffs who sold their souls for money. Now, as they prepared to make their desperate move into the open where death waited with patient malice, Ohiteka found himself studying Abigail's face with entirely new eyes. The frightened widow he had carried from Willow Creek 4 days ago was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had discovered her true strength in the crucible of shared danger and mortal peril. Her jaw was set with iron determination, her eyes clear and steady as winter starlight, and when she looked at him, he saw something there that made his chest tighten with an emotion he had not felt since his wife's death. "Stay close to me," he told her, as they prepared to leave the church's relative safety for the killing ground outside. "Whatever happens out there, don't let them separate us under any circumstances, no matter what they promise or threaten." She nodded her hand, finding his briefly in a gesture that was both practical and deeply personal, carrying weight far beyond its simple appearance. The contact was warm, reassuring, and somehow it made the terrible odds they faced seem slightly less impossible to overcome through sheer determination. The first phase of the battle began before they even reached the land office's front door. As they walked down Main Street with purpose and grim determination, Deputy George Whitlow appeared from the sheriff's office, his young face set with resolve that made him appear older than his 25 years. Mrs. Kozlov, he said, touching his hat respectfully, while his eyes remained alert for danger. I have a sworn statement here from Barnaby Pike, witnessed and properly notarized before Father Mackenzie just this morning. He observed the entire incident, the ambush, the shooting, everything that happened by Willow Creek. Says he was too frightened to come forward before, but he's willing to testify now that he understands what kind of men he's dealing with and what's really at stake. The statement was a gift from heaven itself, legal proof that Abigail had been the victim of attempted murder rather than the willing captive of a savage kidnapper, as Quill's inflammatory posters claimed. But even as Whitlow handed over the precious document, Tom Briggs was moving. With deadly intent that brooked no delay, his hand reaching for the gun at his hip, despite his injured wrist. Ohiteka reacted with the blinding speed of a striking rattlesnake, his own weapon clearing leather before Tom's had even begun to move from its holster. The shot that followed was precise and deliberate, shattering Tom's already injured wrist completely and sending his revolver spinning uselessly into the dusty street. The man's scream of pain and frustrated rage echoed off buildings like the cry of a wounded animal, and suddenly the peaceful morning quiet was shattered by running feet and shouted orders. "Get her inside immediately," Whitlow yelled, drawing his own gun to provide covering fire for their desperate retreat. But Rattler had anticipated exactly this move, and his men were already in carefully prepared positions like pieces on a deadly chessboard. A rifle cracked from the general store's roof, its bullets splintering wooden sidewalk planks where Abigail had been standing mere moments before. More shots followed in rapid succession, turning the peaceful morning into a war zone as townspeople dove for cover and horses reared in absolute terror. Ohiteka pushed Abigail through the land office door, his body shielding hers from the deadly lead flying through the air like metal rain. Inside, the territorial clerk, a nervous man named Morrison, who had never signed up for gunfights when he accepted this quiet government position, was attempting to hide behind his desk while maintaining some semblance of official dignity. "I need to file a homestead claim," Abigail announced with remarkable composure, as if bullets were not currently destroying the windows of his office and threatening to kill them all. Morrison stared at her as if she had completely lost her mind, but years of bureaucratic training took control of his responses. "Do you have all the proper documentation?" he asked, his voice shaking only slightly despite the circumstances that surrounded them. Dr. Hale produced the copied survey map from his medical journal along with Abigail's deed and Barnaby Pike's sworn statement. As Morrison began the official process of recording the claim with methodical precision, the battle outside reached a new and terrifying level of intensity that threatened to overwhelm their defenses. Maud had appeared with a rifle of her own, taking cover behind a water trough and providing surprisingly accurate covering fire for the men trapped in the street. Her shots were deliberate, carefully aimed, and devastatingly effective. The schoolteacher had learned to shoot growing up on a hardscrabble farm, and she had never forgotten those essential lessons in survival. But even as they fought desperately for their lives, Quill was preparing his final, most devastating move. Standing at the edge of the chaos, he turned to Jake Rattler with cold calculation in his pale eyes. "The dam," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "If we can't stop them legally, we'll wash them away. Blow the mining dam upstream. Let the whole godforsaken town drown with them." Rattler's scarred face split in a grin that held no warmth. "Now you're talking sense, boss. Been wanting to see this place burn anyway." As Morrison's pen scratched across the official forms, racing against time and rising water, the most crucial legal transaction in Dakota Territory's history was being completed under fire. Filed and officially recorded. Morrison announced with obvious relief, stamping the documents with the territorial seal just as the first rumble of rushing water began to shake the building's foundations. Mrs. Abigail Kozloff is hereby granted full and complete title to 160 acres on Grey Wolf Knoll, conveying surface title and improvements only. Mineral rights remain subject to location under the 1872 mining law, pertaining thereto under federal law. But even as he spoke those crucial words that might save them all, the Morrison turned the key in the heavy oak door, stamped the seal, and slid Abigail's receipt into her palm. The paperwork complete, just as a distant roar trembled through the street. Flood struck Copper Gulch with the devastating force of divine wrath made manifest. The wall of water released deliberately by Rattler's dynamite charges at the mining dam turned Main Street into a raging river that swept away everything in its relentless path with casual indifference. Horses screamed and flailed helplessly as they were caught in the merciless current, and men who had been shooting at each other moments before now found themselves fighting desperately for their very lives against the remorseless power of moving water. Ohiteka grabbed Abigail as the flood reached the land office, pulling her onto Morrison's sturdy desk as brown water surged through the shattered windows with tremendous force. Morrison clutched his precious record books to his chest, his face white with terror as he realized that all of his carefully maintained files were about to be completely destroyed. "The documents!" Abigail cried, reaching desperately for the homestead papers that were sliding toward the churning water that would destroy them forever. Ohiteka caught them just as they were about to disappear into the flood, his lightning reflexes saving the legal proof of her claim, even as the building groaned and shuddered around them under the water's assault. But the flood was still rising relentlessly, and soon even the desk would be completely submerged beneath the brown torrent. "The roof," he said urgently, pointing to a ladder that led to a trap door in the ceiling. They climbed frantically, the water nipping at their heels like hungry predators seeking prey, and emerged onto the land office roof to find themselves in the middle of an entirely new kind of battlefield. The flood had transformed the town into a series of isolated islands, with survivors clinging desperately to rooftops and upper-story windows, while the brown torrent raged below with unstoppable fury. But Rattler and his remaining men had also found high ground, and they were still shooting with professional determination that nothing could deter. From his position on the saloon's roof, the outlaw leader directed his gunmen with the calm efficiency of a military commander, treating the devastating flood as merely another tactical consideration in his deadly game. The artificial flood had created chaos beyond imagination, but it had also revealed the true character of everyone caught in its waters. As Ohiteka watched, he saw Deputy Whitlow risking his own life to pull an elderly woman from the current, saw Dr. Hale using his medical bag to treat wounded men, regardless of which side they had been fighting on, saw ordinary townspeople displaying extraordinary courage in the face of disaster. But it was Quill's reaction that revealed the depth of his evil. Standing on the roof of his mine office, watching his own flood destroy the town, he was laughing. Actually laughing at the destruction he had caused, the lives he had endangered, the community he had devastated for his own greed. "Look at them scramble," he shouted to Rattler across the water. "Like rats in a barrel, should have done this months ago." It was then that the true battle began. Not just between Ohiteka and the outlaws, but between justice and corruption, between community and greed, between everything good and decent in the world and the evil that sought to destroy it. As the water continued to rise, Abigail found herself separated from Ohiteka by a gap too wide to jump the trapped on a section of roof that was beginning to sag ominously under the pressure. The brown water swirled below, carrying debris and broken furniture in its relentless current. "Ohiteka," she called out, but her voice was lost in the roar of the flood. He saw her predicament, immediately saw the roof beginning to give way beneath her feet. Without hesitation, he dove into the churning water, fighting against the current to reach her. The flood was cold and powerful, filled with debris that struck him as he swam. But he pressed on with grim determination. A piece of broken timber struck him in the shoulder, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding. But he ignored the pain and continued toward where Abigail clung to the collapsing roof. Reaching the building just as the section gave way completely, he caught her as she fell, pulling her against him as they were swept downstream by the relentless current. The water was trying to pull them under, to dash them against the debris that filled the flood like deadly obstacles in a nightmare course. But Ohiteka managed to get them to a partially submerged wagon, pushing Abigail onto its bed, while he clung to the side, his strength beginning to ebb from the wound and the cold water. "Hold on," Deputy Whitlow shouted from a nearby rooftop, throwing them a rope that Abigail managed to catch with desperate hands. But as they were being pulled to safety, Rattler appeared on the roof above them, his rifle trained on Ohiteka's head with deadly intent. "End of the line, Indian," he called out with cold satisfaction. "Should have minded your own business and stayed with your own kind." The shot that rang out was not from Rattler's rifle, but from Abigail's small derringer, a weapon she had kept hidden in her boot throughout their ordeal. The bullet took Rattler in the chest, spinning him around with its impact. As he fell, his own rifle discharged harmlessly into the air, the bullet flying wide of its target. "That's for my husband," she said quietly, though only Ohiteka heard her words above the roar of the flood. "And for all the innocent people you've hurt." As the waters began their slow recession, revealing the muddy devastation that had once been Copper Gulch's thriving main street, the surviving members of Rattler's gang surrendered or fled into the wilderness. The artificial flood had broken their spirit as surely as it had broken the town's buildings. Arthur Quill himself was found clinging to the roof of his mine office, his expensive clothes ruined and his arrogant demeanor replaced by the whimpering of a man who had finally met consequences he could not buy or intimidate his way out of. The evidence of his crimes, the destroyed dam, the witness statements, Dr. Hale's medical records, was overwhelming and undeniable. Sheriff Laurent Decker, when he was finally located, had drowned trying to escape the flood he had helped create. His body found downstream with a bag of gold coins clutched in his dead hands. Payment from his brother for services rendered in the cause of murder and corruption. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the flood-ravaged town in shades of gold and deep red, Abigail found herself in Ohiteka's arms on solid ground at last, holding the water-stained but still legal documents that proved her rightful claim to Grey Wolf Knoll and everything beneath its sacred soil. But far more important than the papers clutched in her trembling hand was the man who held her, the Lakota Warrior, who had risked absolutely everything to keep a promise to a stranger and who had somehow become the most important person in her entire world. The weeks following the Great Flood became known throughout Dakota Territory as the time of reckoning, when the muddy waters receded to reveal not just physical damage to buildings and streets, but the moral corruption that had nearly destroyed an entire community. The aftermath of that terrible day brought changes that would reshape Copper Gulch for generations yet to come. Arthur Quill was sentenced to life in territorial prison for murder conspiracy and the deliberate destruction of the mining dam that had killed 17 people and destroyed half the town. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the destroyed dam witness statements, Dr. Hale's medical records proving his connection to Nikolai's murder, and his own words overheard by dozens of survivors who had watched him laugh while his flood destroyed their homes. Tom Briggs, crippled by his injuries, confessed to his role in the conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided the final pieces of evidence needed to prove that the corruption in Copper Gulch had been systematic and deliberate, reaching to the very highest levels of local government. Deputy George Whitlow was elected sheriff in a landslide, running on a platform of honest law enforcement and equal justice for all citizens, regardless of race or origin. His heroic actions during the flood had earned him respect from every quarter, and his first official act was to establish a new code of conduct for law enforcement that would prevent future corruption. The town itself was rebuilt stronger and better than before, with proper drainage systems that would prevent similar disasters and buildings designed to withstand the harsh Dakota weather. Dr. Hale was elected mayor, and under his guidance, Copper Gulch became a model community where different peoples worked together for the common good. But it was the relationship between Ohiteka and Abigail that truly symbolized the new spirit of cooperation and mutual respect that emerged from the ashes of the old, corrupt order. Their wedding, conducted by Father Mackenzie with traditions from both cultures, was attended by the entire community and celebrated as a symbol of hope for the future. The homestead on Grey Wolf Knoll became a place where the sacred and the practical coexisted in harmony. The copper mine remained sealed out of respect for the burial grounds above it, but the land proved fertile for farming and provided clear, sweet water that sustained both the new family and the broader community. It was while planting their first garden that they made the discovery that would change everything one final time. Working near the spring that gave the knoll its name, Ohiteka unearthed a stone carved with symbols so ancient that even the tribal elders could barely interpret their meaning. The markings revealed the location of underground streams throughout the region, a map left by people so old their names had been forgotten by history. But more than that, the stone showed the locations of small deposits of precious metals, not enough to inspire another gold rush, but sufficient to provide modest prosperity for those who knew where to look. The ancestors knew, Ohiteka said, tracing the carved symbols with reverent fingers. They marked the water and the wealth, leaving instructions for those who would come after and treat the land with respect. Working together with Dr. Hale and the Territorial Survey Office, they used the ancient stone map to help other settlers find good water and avoid the worst ground. The knowledge was shared freely without charge or favor, ensuring that the region developed in a way that honored both its natural resources and its spiritual significance. The small gold deposits remained their secret, shared only with those in genuine need and never exploited for mere profit. They had learned too well the dangers of greed and the value of contentment to risk corrupting their hard-won peace with the pursuit of easy wealth. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of Dakota Territory, they would mark the summer of 1882 as a turning point, when cooperation began to replace conflict and understanding started to bridge the gaps between different peoples. The flood that destroyed old Copper Gulch had washed away more than buildings. It had cleansed the community of the corruption that had nearly destroyed it, leaving room for something better to grow in its place. But for Abigail and Ohiteka, standing together in their garden with the ancient stone map at their feet and their children playing nearby, the real victory was simpler and more personal. They had found each other in the crucible of danger, had built unshakable trust in the face of overwhelming odds, and had discovered that love could indeed bridge any gap when it was based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The Lakota Warrior had gone out hunting and found something far more valuable than meat. He had found a wounded woman who became his partner, a dangerous enemy who became his catalyst for positive change, and a new understanding of what it truly meant to be wealthy in the vast wilderness of the American frontier. As evening fell over, Grey Wolf Knoll painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they walked hand in hand toward their home, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring with the confidence that came from knowing they would face it together. The spring bubbled clear and sweet beside them. The buried ancestors rested peacefully in their sacred grove. And the future stretched ahead, filled with promise and hope. In the distance, an eagle circled overhead, its cry echoing across the sacred ground, where past, present, and future had converged in perfect harmony, and where love had proved stronger than greed, justice more powerful than corruption, and hope more enduring than fear.